really lucky. We get to all hear you talk.
Everyone has been waiting to hear me talk, and here we go. Welcome back, everyone. It's been a little bit, but that's because we've got some awesome episodes in store, and we've been waiting to bring them to you. Super pumped up to have our guest, Jim Mullin, here today. Jim, thanks for coming on. We are excited to have you live on video. And Jim Mullin is the Executive Director of Carbon Utilization with Navigator CO2, responsible for the Navigator Pipeline. Jim, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you found yourself into this niche position?
Yeah, first, thanks, guys, for having me on. I really appreciate it. I've been at Navigator since April, and I came from JBS in the protein industry. And in the protein space are large users of CO2. And if you look back about a year ago, you started seeing some headlines about some of these pipelines that were being built that were going to capture CO2 and inject it and sequester it in different areas of the country. And part of that was I realized that the very same sources of CO2 that at the time we were using were in jeopardy of getting that CO2 directed towards the pipeline and sequestration, which would affect our supply. And it's important to the protein plants to get that CO2, and they can't run the plants without it. Started having those discussions and looked at the cross section and the intersection of where the clean energy economy and CO2 utilization were going to be important in this industry, and really wanted to be in this space. And next thing you know, I'm at Navigator, and I think really the core responsibilities are there's going to be a couple different components to a CO2 platform. And one of it is sequestration, but on the other side is utilization. And that's where I see giving optionality to the customer base to be able to take that CO2 and inject it into the ground, or point it in a direction to some of these newer clean energy fuels and different parts of the clean energy economy.
Yeah, that's great. And so I'm excited to have you on as well. I think it kind of ties everything together. We sit up here and talk about this all the time, talk about pipeline, sequestration, 45Q, the impacts that we think it's going to have on the market. You're out there doing it and living it. You lived it from the protein side, and now you're actually doing the pipeline. So I think it's going to help everybody get a better kind of visual and tangible understanding of what is a pipeline? What does that actually mean? And what are we doing with that? So, and how far along is it? I mean, are we talking next month, next year, next decade? So why don't you give us a quick overview of the Navigator CO2 pipeline itself? What is it? Where is it? How far along are we? When can we expect the first drops of liquid to hit it?
So the original intent and thought process behind building a CO2 pipeline platform, Navigator's core business was in the midstream oil space and building pipe in Western Texas and Oklahoma. And one of their customers at the time approached Navigator and said, will you help us build and connect our ethanol facilities in the Midwest and take that CO2 and look at sequestration? And so a couple of years ago, kicked some tires, tried to figure out how to do that. And then fast forward a couple of years later, and the original intent was to build a 2,300 mile pipeline crossing 5 states where you're going to take CO2 from ammonia facilities and ethanol facilities and then inject it into the Mount Simon Formation in Illinois. And the reason being, in the original intent of targeting the ammonia and the ethanol facilities, is those facilities, as you guys know, have very clean CO2. And to be able to take that CO2, compress it, and put it to 1,800 PSI, give or take, and then sequester it is really the original business plan. But then you fast forward, and this market's changing every month. And then in August, you have the IRA pass to have that CO2 basically at $85 a ton to sequester it. Then things start to change a little bit, and you start bringing other industrial facilities into the mix, and post-combustion CO2, and even power, CO2 emissions from power plants and things like that. So that dynamic across what we've seen is really how we've seen the evolution of the concept of the pipeline.
Yeah, it's so interesting because in those 5 states in the Corn Belt, right, you have a lot of producers of CO2, but also a lot of users of CO2. So we're going to unpack
exactly.
that. I'm curious, as you mentioned, post-combustion, is anybody fair game? I mean, if you have CO2 and you're willing to invest in the infrastructure needed to get it to the pipeline specification, are we open to anybody putting their CO2 into the pipeline and taking advantage of the benefits?
100%. And that's where, going back to what I was just saying about the ethanol and ammonia CO2, I think what the market is starting to learn is, and again, coming from a large protein company where there was a very strong focus on reducing CO2 emissions. And when you look at some of these companies and you say, okay, we have to reduce 30% of our emissions, and you can do energy efficiency and maybe get 5 or 10% of the way there. You can do long-term power purchase agreements, but a lot of these entities are not in deregulated markets where they can go purchase, get these power purchase agreements for wind and solar because they're behind regulated utilities. There's other parts of it where solar projects are great, and I think aesthetically they're very good things to implement across a lot of different facilities. But in terms of CO2 reduction, you don't get your biggest bang for the buck. And so what the market is learning is you can capture those boiler emissions, or even have on-site electricity production and capture that CO2 as well, and put that on the pipeline. And ultimately you get to a point where that's the biggest bang for your buck when you're talking about decarbonization of large protein facilities, or it could be any industrial facility. It could be beverage companies. It could be whatever products anybody's making. If they're close enough to the pipeline, it's really a function of distance and volume of your CO2. And I think we're going to see new businesses created from this, where even if it's not a lot of CO2, we're looking to build out areas along the pipeline where you can take your CO2 and put it on the pipeline. And so anybody is fair game. And what we want to do is provide the most value to the customer base, where we can start to solve solve the CO2 greenhouse gas issue.
So essentially, you're going to build out a trunk line across these 5 states, these 2,300 miles, then you're going to spider into somebody's backyard. Basically, I can run a pipe up to your backyard for the large users. Those that maybe aren't as large, you might have a hub spoke somewhere that you can truck over your CO2 and then inject it into the pipeline, I assume.
Yeah, where does your scope start and stop, and where does it tie into the customers?
And then to piggyback on that, where are we? I mean, is there shovels in the ground yet on this pipeline? I mean, I know we've got a well, and a permitted well. I believe it's permitted, but where are we at that from there?
At the 10,000 foot view in terms of permitting, we're going to have different phases of the permitting at the state level and at the federal level, which I know we've submitted most of those permits. In terms of landowner acquisition, we are, and I hate to put a firm number on the percentage, but we are working towards that very quickly. It is a priority for Navigator. And then in terms of meeting goals and wanting to have pipe in the ground, I would say at the beginning of 2024 is when we're looking to start to begin that process. We're going to build from the sequestration site out. We're going to have multiple different areas of the pipeline being built at one time, and with the end goal of, I would say, in service in the middle of 2025, that phase 1 approach to the Navigator system. The sequestration site, as I mentioned, will be in and around the Springfield, Illinois area, and that will, like I said, will be the first thing built. We're going to have multiple sequestration sites for redundancy purposes and resiliency purposes. In terms of looking back at the carbon management platform, we don't just want it to be viewed as taking CO2 and sequestering it. Again, we want to give our customer base that optionality to sell CO2 into the marketplace. And we're seeing a lot of different industries come to the table. It's actually been fascinating for me is e-fuels and being able to combine CO2 with green hydrogen. And what makes that appealing is in Illinois, you've got MISO and PJM as RTOs in the electric space. And to be able to take solar and wind and other types of technology and potentially bring hydrogen to market, or maybe you're making hydrogen, blue hydrogen with CO2 capture, right? And blending it with other CO2 on the pipe. And so there's just different avenues, and we're learning each month about what this is going to look like. But again, we want to be able to also have the ability to take that CO2 and use it for whatever industry that you're in, be it beverage, protein. It could be CO2 is used in the wastewater treatment process. Because right now I see in the Midwest, in the Corn Belt, going back to the supply of CO2, I see up to 70% of all CO2 getting pointed towards sequestration. And so if you're a user of CO2, as long as you're planning and educating yourselves on this space and what's happening, I think there's plenty of time to solve and make sure that you are aligning and getting the CO2 you need once this switch is flipped.
Yeah, I think it kind of feeds in. No, sorry.
No, I want
think
you to
it,
touch on.
Oh,
on
yeah,
all this.
yeah. I think it feeds into pretty much everything that we believe in. That first and foremost, you have to be in the black before you're into the green, right? Like this has to make sense, and just getting paid to put it into the ground isn't a feasible financial model 10, 20, 30 years from now. There has to be
Right.
other avenues, and so the other part of that is finding constructive uses for the CO2 is far more important. So you mentioned, e-fuels and biofuels and aviation fuel, sustainable aviation fuel. You take this hydrogen, and whether green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, purple, pink, unicorn hydrogen, whatever color hydrogen it is, at the end of the day, you mix it in there with the CO2. And we don't have enough CO2 today to sustain that, which is a good thing. So we're going to be capturing all this. We could actually use it as opposed to sequestering 70% of it like you're talking about. But I think it feeds into all of those different aspects and attributes of the market that ultimately we need. And it just goes back to reinforce where you get your CO2 from today probably isn't where it's coming from tomorrow. So kind of, having said that, talk about who's signed on with you. I know you've got some public declarations out there, LOIs or MOUs with the multiple partners. Who's signed on saying we want this pipeline and we want to start sequestering.
Right. I think so. Poet is going to be a large anchor tenant. You've got Valero as well, and then some other partners, Big River, OCI, and between them, we're at about 11 million tons of 15 million tons capacity right now. There's a lot of other entities that we're talking to in the mix to fill up that remaining 4 million tons. And it's something that's going to be, again, super exciting, where we couldn't be happier to have those types of customers on the system, some of the largest producers of ethanol in the world. And then the other part, going back to a little bit what you were saying in terms of what CO2 is going to look like in the future, is part of the reason we're seeing some of these new markets in this space is that the way the current market is structured is CO2 is a byproduct, right? And that's, you had an ethanol plant that said, okay, if I'm making ethanol, sure, you can have the CO2 at a certain price. And so you had some interruptibleness, if that's a word, to the market. And being an end user, if I put my end user hat on and coming from one of the larger purchasers of CO2 in the US, that was a giant headache because there was no firmness to the market. And what we're trying to solve here too, which I think is going to happen, and it could change, but I think it's probably the best model, where you get not only the lowest price, but the highest, basically the highest redundancy and the highest security of your product and getting it to your plant that can't run without it. And so where those two meet is where you really want to be. And you've had this market be interruptible for so long that if you had a company that was even entertaining making an e-fuel or a SAF or something like that in the past, you look at the financing and you say, gosh, well, what if your CO2 source goes down? And they would say, well, geez, maybe we'll get it from that plant over there. You just couldn't really design a marketplace. But now that you've got a pipeline system and a platform where you've got 40, 50, 60 different sources of CO2 on the system, now they say, okay, wow, all right, we've got that resiliency, redundancy. We have a much higher probability of getting that CO2. So that becomes a solvable next step for them to go into, okay, now we know that that's there. Let's go to the green, let's go to solar, let's go to wind, let's see what that looks like. Or let's go to power generation with CO2 capture and let's see what that looks like. And so you're seeing that next evolution step in making some of these renewable fuels. And I think all of us are learning every single month. It's not like we're experts in that, but we have people coming to us looking for that CO2. It's exciting.
Yeah, I know Luke's got like 10 questions to follow up on, but I wanted to throw one at you. Just
11,
just
so
for
everybody
a quick
at
answer.
home.
Yeah. put your supply chain hat back on. Is $85 a ton the new low end baseline price of CO2 going forward 5 years from now, whatever it is?
Great question. I think there's a couple different parts to it. So the first part of this is we talked about how in the Midwest, the majority of the CO2 that all of the users of CO2 get are coming from ammonia plants and ethanol plants, right? And we mentioned that up to 70% of those plants could point that CO2 towards sequestration. And now there's some other drivers to that, like the 45Z, where if it's the 45Q, yeah, it might, that $85 per ton might be the floor, but you have to make some adjustments to it because that $85 per ton is an after-tax number, right? And so if they're going to have sales of CO2, you kind of have to have an apples-to-apples comparison. So true it up by dividing by 1 minus their tax rate. And so that's where that apples-to-apples floor would theoretically be. But then at the same time, I said 70% of supply could be going away. And then now you're introducing some incremental demand to the market with some of these e-fuels, right? And the volumes that some of these, to make an e-fuel, to make SAF, are very significant volumes of CO2. So you're increasing demand and decreasing supply. Now, do I think that could create a runaway bull market in CO2? I don't think so, because there's going to be enough CO2 out there. But I think it's going to take a forward-looking, not reactionary type mentality. It's recognizing that the federal government has stepped in and said, okay, we'll buy all and any CO2 at $85 a ton. And so if you're an entity using CO2 right now, I think now's the time to plan, because if you fast forward a year and a half, 2 years, that's going to be too late. You could have an oversubscribed pipeline. You could have an oversubscribed offtake facility that now other companies had seen what was going to happen in this CO2 space, and they capture that they have a long-term offtake agreement to get CO2 off of an offtake hub potentially, and that capacity to clean up to beverage grade is already fully subscribed. So now is the time for planning. I think there's plenty of time to plan. I think there's plenty of CO2. It's just, they're going to have to pay a little bit more than where the market is for a longer term and have these offtake agreements, because the 45Q is 12 years and it's going to have staying power. It's not going to go away in a couple of years. And so that's what we're seeing right now in this space is really more education than anything else. And we're open to really any types of ideas to make this even better and more to give some more security to the end user space.
Yeah, well spoken, Jim. And I just think it's important for our audience to hear that, right? Is we've been saying it. Proactivity is really the biggest piece right now. Don't be ignorant to what's happening. Everybody's still safe. There's opportunity to secure CO2, but being able to educate yourself and to make the steps now to ensure that you have that CO2 available for you, when things do start to tighten up or when the landscape changes, is so important. And go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was going to say, and one thing that we hear too is there's a little bit of denial in that, okay, well, not all the ethanol plants are going to be able to take their CO2 and sequester it. And I agree with that. I think that's a fair point. But if you really look at how this clean energy economy is moving forward, right, you've got a transportation sector that is in critical need of decarbonizing. And so when you talk about an ethanol facility, you've got an ethanol facility that needs to decarbonize it as well. And their core product and their core business is selling ethanol. So if you are an ethanol plant, but you're not connected to a pipeline, you're going to do anything you can to take your CO2 and get at least a good chunk of it sequestered, or else your ethanol in the supply stack of ethanol is, quote unquote, even though it could be clean, it could be the dirtiest if you fast forward 5 years from now, right? And maybe it's not marketable. So there you are, your core business is selling ethanol. You don't have that low carbon footprint. All of a sudden, you may not be selling as much ethanol as you think. And so what I've heard a lot is, oh yeah, we're just going to build a CO2 capture plant on an ethanol plant that isn't in the line of sight for a sequestration pipeline. And I'm like, well, are you really going to go allocate $5, $10, $15, $20 million to a facility that may not be relevant in a handful of years? And they look back and kick tires and say, okay, well, All right, we're starting to see that. So I think there's a lot of great questions. There's a lot of probing into what business model is really going to work. But the redundancy model, the offtake model, having all different diverse supply mixes, understanding the price you're going to have to pay, and then really it's more of a set it and forget it. Again, this is my utilization hat on, is that market needs a set it and forget it and reliability angle. And I think they can do it with some proactiveness.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a great point on I think what you're kind of dancing around, not dancing around, but getting to the carbon intensity score. And, I've heard it said that's probably the best way to measure, the viability, the greenness of any product. And I think you're going to see more and more of that going forward. Whole nother episode for us to kind of educate on both ourselves and the market on what the carbon intensity score means. But what you're saying about that, ethanol is ethanol all up until you say, how green is your ethanol relative to somebody else's ethanol, and they'll get higher tax breaks, better payouts, and more viable in the market, the supply market. So that's a real interesting one. So go ahead.
And one more point, and is that if you think long term too, so if you're in the Corn Belt, we've had some pushback against carbon pipelines. It's not just ours; it's just the general concept. And if you are an ethanol producer or a corn farmer, and I do think this is a really important part of what we're trying to build towards this clean energy economy, is long term. If you do have a push towards EVs, and I think there's plenty of traction for it, right? So when EVs go up, ethanol demand is going to go lower, but it doesn't mean that the ethanol business goes away. I think if you have low carbon ethanol, right, and whether it's EVs or some alternative fuel, it could be an ethanol to jet fuel pathway, is by having carbon capture, you are able to have the lowest carbon intensity fuel, whether it's pointed towards the transportation sector in terms of cars, or pointed towards some other type of business. So let's say from an from airplanes, right? So, or whether it's pointed towards airplanes, is you're going to be positioned long term with the lowest carbon intensity fuel that could be pointed towards anything. So I think if you're a farmer, if you're involved in ethanol, that it's critically important to have that optionality in the long term to be able to make that fuel that could position yourselves for any type of market going forward.
Yeah, I agree. Really interesting. And I think it's just important to note quick, right? You mentioned 15 million tons per year into the pipeline. You said this isn't going away. The tax credit is 12 years. 15 million tons, in speaking with you actually before the show, drop in the bucket for what the well is able to hold. And so this is certainly going to have staying power. And I think it's really beneficial to have you on today and let everybody see that the pipeline guys aren't the big bad guys, right? But there's actually a lot of opportunity here for producers to find an economic means to achieve stated goals, right? So we've heard a lot of talk, and this is maybe a pathway forward to be in the green and to be in the black, obviously. And also, if you're looking to secure some supply, hearing it said that, we're not going to just sequester, but we're going to figure out how to ensure that we are supply and demands in the market as they tick up with, the SAF and everything taking place that's going to need CO2. So really educational today, Jim. Seriously, this was fantastic. I think everybody is going to find a lot of value in what you had to say. And we appreciate your time.
Yeah, we'll put your contact information in the show notes. But if I'm a big producer of CO2, I want to get onto your pipeline. How do I get in touch with you?
Our website, navigatorco2.com. More than happy to work with anyone, whether you have the need for CO2, if you want to sequester CO2, if you have sustainability goals to meet and have a ton of questions, more than happy to talk there. If you have ideas with the types of trucks that could be bringing CO2 to our pipeline, you name it. We want to be a part of this clean energy economy. We've got a great asset that is going to help solve what is a very big problem. And please reach out.
Yeah, you just signed up for no sleep because that inbox is about to blow up. So,
it's awesome. Could be a good thing. I hope it's
Good stuff.
Hey, have a great week. Have a great Thanksgiving.
You too, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.